Simple Suburban Murder. Tom and Scott Mystery. Book 1. Author Mark Richard Zubro. Publisher St. Martin's Press, New York. Narrator Eric Ost. For Kathy. Chapter 9. Quickly I doused the light. I reached out for Scott, found him, drew him close. I put my lips next to his ear. Which direction did that come from? He shook his head. I couldn't tell. We waited for the noise to recur. 1 light year passed, then another. I tried to breathe easier. I turned to whisper to Scott. The noise came again louder. "That's breaking glass," I said into his ear. "Someone else wants to get in." Above us, this section of the warehouse was 2 stories high. A grid of steel beams and catwalks crossed the area above. They were backlit by dust-encrusted and begrimed skylights. The lighting was uncertain, but there was enough so that without the flashlight we could make out vague shapes. We moved carefully forward until we could look around the torture rack. The noise didn't come again. Soon we heard footsteps moving unsteadily about. There was a bang, a series of crashes, and a thump. It sounded like someone ran into one of the cameras or light fixtures, knocking one over and causing a chain reaction. The person swore. A 5-minute silence ensued. My leg muscles began complaining about being forced to remain in one position. Then a slow, scraping sound came from our left. Interminable increments of time crept by as the scraping came closer. Slowly, the volume of the scraping increased. Soon, I knew the person making the noise was in the same staging area. I guessed whoever it was didn't belong here as much as we. The person must be equally as frightened. I decided to risk a light. The second after I pushed the knob, the thought struck me. What if this person has a gun? The light would give them an excellent target. Before I could turn it off, Scott, his eyes quicker to adjust, said, "It's Greg!" It was. We got up stiffly from our hiding place and hurried over to him. "What the hell are you doing here?" Scott demanded. "I'm hurt." Greg clutched his left knee. I pulled the pant's leg up. "What happened?" I asked. "I fell and twisted my knee. Then this big thing dumped square onto it. My knee hurts." I shined the light on the knee. The skin wasn't broken. Scott stooped down. Carefully, he placed his fingertips on the front, back, and side of the knee. At one point, Greg cried out and clenched in agony. Scott said, "I've seen this kind of thing once before." A guy mashed his knees, falling into the dugout while chasing a foul ball. A 50-pound bag of bats tipped onto his knee as he landed. "We have to get you to a doctor. We'll have to carry him." I nodded. Greg lay on the ground, his good leg bent. He was in obvious pain. "What are you doing here?" I repeated Scott's question. "Looking for Phil," he said through gritted teeth. "You knew he was here?" Scott forgot to whisper. Greg winced in pain. He said, "Not when you left my sister's. I'm not even sure now." "How'd you find out about this place?" "I asked my sister more questions when she got back. This is where she said to look. Sometimes kids stayed here. She said kids who had parts in the movies with no place else to go. We haven't found anyone else here, but we've only been through half of it with all your noise. If anybody was here, they've been long since alerted." I said, "Maybe not. This area is fairly soundproof around stage sets. You've been here before." In the flashlight glow, I saw him hang his head. "Yeah, I've been in some of the movies, but I swear, Mr. Mason, I never knew kids stayed here. I never knew they made gay movies either. My sister got me occasional jobs here," he added hurriedly, "in straight porno only." "Why, Greg?" I asked. "It was fun. I was popular here. There were no tests like in school. I had one of the major qualifications. My dick could stay hard for hours. Here no one laughed and made fun of my being stupid. It paid decent money too." Scott asked, "If you were in porno movies, why did it bother you that your sister was a whore?" "This is a hobby. Fun, not a job. I'm not a prostitute. Besides, she's my sister. I have to look out for her. Whether this was misguided, sexist, chivalry, or what, I didn't know." He shifted his weight. The movement made him cry out again. He asked, "How'd you guys find out about this place?" I told him, leaving out Neil's name. When done explaining, I said, "We've searched about half this place. We'll leave you here and finish looking. If Phil is here, he may be tied up, unable to yell. There can't be any guard. They'd be here by now. We'll go as quickly as we can, then we'll get you to a doctor." It took 15 nerve-wracking minutes to go through the rest of the warehouse. Less afraid of noise now, we searched more quickly. There was no sign of Phil. No way of telling if he'd ever been there. The warehouse was deserted, a dead end. We went back for Greg. "He needs an ambulance," Scott said. "We can't call. None of us is supposed to be in here," I replied. "Let's get out first, then we can make decisions." By clasping each other's arms halfway to the elbow, we made a sort of seat for Greg. He handled the toolkit and flashlight and guided us as we moved slowly and awkwardly toward the back. Careful as we were, unfortunate jostlings caused him pain. While Greg wasn't a big person, he was heavy enough that we were forced to stop several times. At one stop, I asked Greg why he hadn't been afraid of tripping the alarm. He shrugged at me. He hadn't thought of it. A naive suburban kid. I tried to hurry us along. 10 feet from the back exit, we had to stop again. "I'll get the car," Scott said. "We won't have to carry him as far." I nodded, rubbed my arms to restore the circulation. "Hurry," I called to him. "I want to try the locks on these storage bays before we leave." "Oh, shit," Scott said from the doorway. "What?" I asked. "Someone's coming. There's a moving van backing up in the parking lot." Scott relocked the door and scrambled over to us. We picked up Greg. He clenched his teeth to stifle his cries of pain. Our haste precluded gentleness. We hurried through the first door we'd gone through into the office room. We laid Greg behind the large desk. Scott and I crept back to the door. We opened it a crack and looked out. One of the large garage doors rumbled open. Someone backed up a semi-trailer to the delivery bay. One person was in the warehouse guiding the truck in. Red lights flashed as the brakes were pumped on and off. We heard a minor thump. The truck lights went out. Darkness returned for a moment. Then the man inside turned a switch. Several bare bulbs poked the darkness with feeble light. 3 other men joined the first one. When the lights came on, I thought of closing the door, but it was too late. I was afraid any sudden movement would draw attention to our position. The 4 of them began walking toward the door, behind which we crouched. They moved casually and at ease. Their errand was not an urgent one, I guessed. They came closer. Fighting it out with them was absurd. We had Greg to think of, so we couldn't try a mad dash to freedom. They got closer, 20 feet, 10 feet. Up close, I recognized them. All 4 were at the party earlier. One was Edgar. I could hear their conversation. One I didn't know said, "I don't see why we have to move this stuff now. I could be in bed with that cute young thing." "Put a lid on it," another said. "The boss wants this moved now, so now is when we move it." They were close enough for me to touch them. I held my breath. They walked past the door. Their voices receded as they passed beyond my line of sight. I drew a trembling breath. A short time later they returned from some distant storage area, carrying large wooden crates. From their stooped postures as they carried the boxes, I guessed what was inside must be heavy. They deposited the boxes in the truck and marched back out of our sight. "We've got to do something," Scott whispered. "They could walk in here any minute." "I'm open to suggestions," I said. We were silent as the 4 of them trudged by with another consignment. After they passed back the other way, Scott said, "Why the hell do they have such a huge moving truck? You could put several housefuls of furniture in that one easy," I said. "Whatever they're up to has to be illegal, or why do it at this hour of the morning?" "I'm going to set off the fire alarm," Scott announced. "Are you nuts? We're still the illegal ones here." While they're distracted with the firemen, we grab Greg and get clear out. The noise from the alarm will cover our exit. He moved off before I could grab him and stop him. Seconds later, the alarm began clanging. We snatched Greg and headed out toward the front, but it was useless. We made it to the second stage set, and they were right behind us. We hid behind a fake fireplace. Again, we could hear their voices. Edgar definitely was in charge. His authoritative voice, no longer a slurred with drink, cut across the distance clearly. "We'll meet them outside," he barked. "We don't want them snooping in here." They all hurried past us toward the front. "Out the back," I said. With Greg, we made a slow dash to the back entrance. For the first time, I saw the open bay they'd been working from. I could make out a 10-foot high, 10-foot wide opening filled with the wooden boxes. When we got to the car, I said, "Stay here with Greg. I'm going back to look in that storage bay." I left before Scott could argue. I ran to the warehouse, through the door, and to the storage bay. Quickly, I examined the boxes. I tried opening some of them. They'd been nailed tightly shut. The outsides gave no indication of the contents. An aisle between boxes led into the interior. I pushed further into the room. I heard footsteps rush up behind me and whirled. It was Scott. "Hurry," he commanded, looking over his shoulder. "They'll be here any second." "A minute more." I pushed further and turned a corner. My stomach did a flip in the dark recesses, set a cramped and grimy movie set. On the floor, there was a long box, separated from the others. No boxes rested on top of it, because a body dangled there, its toes resting slightly on the lid of the box. Below, I knew this was where they made the snuff movies. I rushed to the body. "Scott!" I called as loudly as I dared. In a moment, he was beside me, his face drained too sickly white. The body dangled by a short rope tied by the wrist to a beam above. There were deep gash marks on the face and ugly stab wounds on the arms and legs. Up close, the body stank, but it was warm to the touch. I saw the chest shudder feebly. "He's alive!" I said. We scrambled to untie the knots. We stood on the box to get to the rope. We had no knife. Precious moments ticked by as we worked at the tangle of knots. We lowered the body. The face was horribly torn and bruised. It was Phil. He was unconscious. We had him nearly down when Scott stumbled. He fell heavily, smashing open the box. Beneath. The noise was horrendous. I hoped Edgar and the crew were far away, or that a fireman was nearby and would come to investigate. Anything but Edgar and the boys by themselves. I'd managed to keep myself and Phil from falling when Scott fell. He picked himself up. I eased Phil to the ground and looked at the newly opened box. Styrofoam packing material had flown all over. Scott was closer to the box. He turned his head to see what he landed in. Then I caught a glimpse. It was a body. A naked woman. A girl, I corrected after a closer look. She might have been 14 or 15. Maybe pretty at one time. She was dead. They had mutilated her worse than Phil. One breast hanging half off. I listened to Scott being sick in the corner. I stood up, inert as I was at one time to death. This was tough. I felt lightheaded, but I kept my stomach under control. We had to get out. I checked Phil. He breathed shallowly, but was otherwise frighteningly still. "Who's in there?" a harsh voice called from the front. I walked back down the aisle between the boxes. Edgar and his cronies blocked the entrance. Edgar had a gun. There was no fireman. For the first time, I lost hope. "One last thing," a voice from behind them called. An immense figure appeared in the opening. His fireman's coat could not hide a figure of some heft. His face bulged redly, topped by a glowing red nose. His ears stuck out from under his fireman's hat. He was uglier than a mud fence. I could have kissed him. Other firemen crowded behind him. None of them could see the gun. "These men are murderers," I announced loudly. "This man is here illegally. He must have broken in," Edgar said. "I want you to arrest them." He corrected as Scott walked up beside me. Scott wobbled as he walked, barely recovered. I talked directly to the fireman. "There's a dead body back there, and a boy who needs immediate medical attention, if it isn't already too late." The situation was one Edgar hadn't prepared for. He couldn't kill all of us or murder me in front of such a crowd. He swung the gun to cover the whole group. The fat, ugly fireman caught the movement. His hand blurred and the gun skittered across the floor. "Run!" Edgar yelled. He and the boys made a break for it. The big fireman moved faster than an all-pro lineman. He blocked 3 of them, but Edgar sprinted around him, and then through the other startled firemen I gave chase. He got halfway to the truck only because I had to leap over several boxes before I hit full stride. I tackled him elegantly. There was a delightful crack as his skull met the pavement. He didn't move. They called ambulances to take Phil and Greg. I asked to go with them, but the police wanted us there for questioning. It was long past dawn when we finished talking to the cops. I gulped coffee to stay awake. Scott, quiet through most of the interrogation, added nods of confirmation at critical points. Cops appeared in the background to stare at him. No one asked for an autograph. Kiddie porn filled the boxes ready for shipment to distributors. The police arrested Edgar and the other 3. I never did get their names. The police led them away to waiting police cars. We wound up at the 18th District Police Station on Chicago Avenue. Around 7, I called school to say I wouldn't be in. At 9:15, Frank Murphy and John Robertson showed up. Robertson wore a scowl, but stayed silent for most of the conversation. Frank seemed to be in charge for the moment. The Chicago cop who'd been questioning us, Lieutenant King, greeted Frank by his first name. They obviously knew each other. King told them the story. "We owe these 2 a pretty big vote of thanks," he concluded. Frank smiled as he said, "Yeah, they wouldn't listen to us and keep their noses clean." I wasn't in the mood for anybody's smile. "Did we uncover a major criminal operation? A dead kid?" I asked. "Yeah," Frank said. "Take it easy." "Sorry, I'm tired." I apologized. I turned to King. "Who was the girl?" "We don't know," he answered. "Could the medical people tell what happened?" I asked. "Only the obvious for now. Someone tortured both kids for an extended period. She probably died from the wounds. We won't know for sure until she's been examined at the lab." "It might be on a film," I said. "We'll go through all of them, of course. Everything there will be inspected carefully," the lieutenant said. "Will you arrest North?" I asked. "We'll question him. But right now we have those 4 guys." He flipped his notebook shut. "You 2 can go after you sign a statement. By the way, the commander told us to overlook your little break-in." "Thanks," we both muttered. "No problem. The department can't arrest the city's biggest baseball hero after he breaks up a kiddie porn ring and discovers a murder. Speaking of which, the press has been crawling around. Word is out. You're here, Mr. Carpenter. If you want, when you're done, we can get you out of here without you having to mess with them." "Thanks," Scott said to the 2 suburban cops. King said, "I imagine you'll want to talk to them." He left Frank sat on the edge of a cluttered desk. Robertson stood by the door. Scott sat on a black cot-like couch. Next to the desk, I slouched in the chair behind the desk. "Did these guys kill Evans?" Scott asked. "Yes," Robertson said. "No," I said. We glared at each other. He looked away first. "Let me tell you what we found in the last 36 hours, I said. I told them everything. They wrote busily as I spoke. At one point, Frank placed a call to the station giving them the access code to the disk. I felt a twinge of guilt in breaking my promise to Sylvester and Armstrong when I told him the code, but the explanation made no sense without it. Still, I didn't reveal the significance of the data to them. At least they'd have to figure that out by themselves. I finished my explanation. "Lock them both up," Robertson snarled when I finished. Frank grinned at him. "I don't think so. The press will make a deal out of this. You heard King. They'll play the Carpenter hero angle big. Do you really want to be the one responsible for arresting the hero of the hour? And remember, at the moment, we have no jurisdiction or standing here." "How do you 2 know about all this?" I asked. "Courtesy call," Frank answered. "When you talked too much about what happened to Evans, the lieutenant called me. I got the impression he knew you. We grew up in Chicago in the same neighborhood. We were in the same class in the training academy. I moved to the suburbs. He stayed in the city." Frank shifted his weight on the desk. "Back to the subject at hand. Why didn't these guys kill Evans?" "Evans wasn't a threat to their boss. Nowhere on the data disk did it indicate anything that would link him to North." "Maybe you didn't recognize it," Frank said. "I'm pretty sure I would have. Once you understand how he tracked the data, it's pretty easy to follow." "Okay. North wasn't on the disk. Go ahead." North wouldn't have killed. Remember, they were working a deal that last night. No, the scheme with North was a constant supply of vast sums of ready cash for both of them. Evans gambled his way. Then he borrowed from North. Evans always needed more. He turned to all the ways I've described to make it. Then Vance could still be our man, Robertson said. No, don't forget the administrator saw Evans alive later. So he's our man. I can't see it. I admit I've been suspicious of them, and I don't trust them, but administrators are a generic lot. As a rule, they wouldn't have the courage to kill someone. This guy is the same. From what you said, he doesn't have an alibi. No, but I just don't think he did it. And according to North, his man, Edgar, saw Evans even later than Armstrong. I admitted feeling odd defending an administrator. Robertson snapped. We'll be questioning him. More calmly, Frank said. We'll be re-questioning everybody. We'll have to puzzle it out. Are you going to go deeper into this setup here? I inquired. No, Frank answered. This was a separate matter. This was a source of money, not murder. In my opinion, this isn't our problem. We need to solve a simple suburban murder. Are you going to release Vance? I asked. I imagine so, Frank said. He eased himself off the desk. They went off to re-question suspects and witnesses. We went to Scott's to get some sleep. We woke up at 3 in the morning. I called the hospital. Greg had been released. They wouldn't tell us much about Phil. I called Greg's house. Other than a broken knee, he was fine. Before we went to see Phil in the hospital, I called Frank Murphy to see if Vance had been released. When Frank said yes, I called Vance at home. We stopped at his house before we went to the hospital. He greeted us effusively. I owe you both a great deal, the police told me. What you did, I can't thank you enough. I asked him to explain the gambling operation to us in light of what we found on the disc. He said, it started small, just a few of us. We went on that way for a long time. For a while it simply grew, then one day we woke up and it was too big for us. Too big? How so? 2 ways. One, on big events, we had to cover too many bets. Soon we wouldn't be able to afford our own success. That led to the second problem. We made too much money. The local bookmaking people were unhappy. That's where we made our mistake. Evans said he knew someone who could solve our problem. I didn't want to trust Evans, but there wasn't much choice. In an amazingly short time, Evans was in full control. How did he keep control? He knew an enforcer who could collect from people who wouldn't pay. When we were small, no one cared if someone owed. We carried them until they could pay. With Evans, if people got behind, the enforcer came for a visit. How about yourself? You owed a great deal. I was paying in installments. A lot of the money Evans had on him that night was mine. I understand, I said. Do you know how Evans lost so much money? That I don't know. I presume he gambled heavily and lost. It's that simple, I guess, I said. When we got up to leave, I asked him why he told Armstrong about my visits. Sylvester followed you to my office. I couldn't deny it. Armstrong threatened me. I'm afraid I'm not a strong man. We went to the hospital to see Phil. Mrs. Evans and Keith were there along with Heather Delacroix. They formed a group around a doctor outside Phil's room. We hurried to join them. After introducing ourselves to the doctor, we asked how Phil was. I just told Mrs. Evans that external injuries aren't bad. We've talked to a plastic surgeon already. He assures us that in time Phil can look normal again. She shook her head. It's his internal injuries we have to worry about right now. We're still testing to find the extent of the damage. The beating he took is worse than any I've seen in my 15 years of practice. As soon as I get the final results later this afternoon, I'll be in to tell you more. Mrs. Evans leaned heavily against Heather. The social worker led her to a bench. Did you want to ask the doctor any questions? Heather asked. Mrs. Evans shook her head, a feeble no. Perhaps I could get something for Mrs. Evans, the doctor said. Mrs. Evans took out a handkerchief from her purse and began twisting it in her hands. She darted quick dabs at her eyes and nose with it, then go back to mauling the hanky. Heather answered for her. Why don't you bring something, doctor? I'll see if I can't get her to take it. Can we see Phil? I asked before the doctor left. She looked us over carefully. Heather, who'd obviously talked with the doctor before, nodded and spoke up first. The doctor let us in. We entered the room. Keith slipped in with us. He hadn't said anything, simply stood mutely, watching the circle of adults in the hushed presence of familial tragedy. He wore a jean jacket over a Chicago Bears sweatshirt. Keith stood between us as we placed ourselves at the side of Phil's bed. He was awake. Thick bandages covered his face and arms. He smiled when his eyes lit on Keith. Phil held out his hand to his younger brother, awkwardly, uncertainly. The 13-year-old took it. "How are you, Tiger?" Phil's voice came out a hoarse croak. "I'm okay," Keith whispered back. "I wish they'd let you see me earlier. They wouldn't let me." "That's okay. You're here now." He occasionally rasped for extra breath. He lay unnaturally still, his head inclined only slightly toward us. His eyes blinked and his hand clutched Keith's. No other movement. "Thanks for rescuing me, you guys," he said to us. "The police have asked me as many questions as the doctor would allow. They told me you found me. How did you wind up there?" His eyes shut briefly before he started his story. "I tried to leave North Stable. I found out he and my dad worked together." "How did you find out?" "I overheard two of his assistants talking about somebody named Evans. At first I thought it was me they were talking about, but some of what they said didn't make sense. Then it dawned on me that they were talking about my dad. Later I talked to one of the guys I trusted. He filled me in. He was surprised I didn't know. I confronted North. He laughed at my ignorance. I didn't want to stay. I didn't want anything to do with somebody connected to a slime like my dad. I walked out on North. He warned me not to. He said I'd be sorry. I escaped. I ran straight to Daphne." Slight laugh escaped his lips. "She delayed me in the bar long enough to call North and have two of the gang come get me. I tried to get a message to Greg, but he came in only 5 minutes before the goon squad showed up. I only had time to tell him to call for help." "Greg knew about the womb?" I asked. "Yeah, the cops told me about him being with you guys. He used to come to the womb once in a while. He wasn't gay or anything. Sometimes the cast and crew from a movie would go there to celebrate after they wrapped it up. They added a little more sleaze, as if you'd notice in that place. He must have been the one who called your mom," I explained, my guess to Phil. "It must have been him. She was the wrong person to call." "He did his best," I said. "Yeah, he never was the brightest, but a good guy." "So what happened?" I asked. "They took me to the warehouse. I managed to get to a phone and call Keith. Your number isn't listed, Mr. Mason. I tried to get you first. That's why I didn't have much time to talk to Keith, but I knew I could count on him to get to you." For a moment, Phil's hand squeezed Keith's more tightly. "They caught me before I could say much. It was worse after that. They tied me up, tortured me." He stopped for a while. As he talked, he'd occasionally pause in obvious pain. In a few minutes, he collected himself and continued. "After that, I don't remember much until I woke up here." Phil turned his attention to Keith, drawing the youngster closer. "If anything happens to me, if I die—" "You're not going to die," Keith interrupted. "You've got to listen, Tiger. Please, cool down like the other night, remember? What I said that night, I promised no one would ever hurt you again." Keith nodded. "I meant it. No one is ever going to bother you, ever. That's what's going to make me better, my promise to you." His breathing came shallow and uneven. The emotional exertion drained him. "Take it easy, Phil," I warned. He ignored me. "Keith, I want you to promise me now, though. If I don't get better, you will be strong and take care of yourself. I got away. You can too. You know we both broke away once." He gasped heavily. Keith shook his head. "You're not going to die. You can't." Phil lay back completely drained. His face turned stark, white. His features clenched in agony. I summoned the nurse. She bustled us out of the room. Minutes later, the doctor hurried by us into the room. Heather met us outside. "Mrs. Evans is under sedation. I've got her napping down the hall." Then all hell broke loose. People began rushing in and out of Phil's room. They flung large machines through the door. An hour passed. We couldn't get any answers to our questions. The doctor came out. She came over to us. "Where is Mrs. Evans?" she asked. Heather explained. "Better get her," the doctor said. She looked at the rest of us. "It won't hurt if you all come in now." "How is he?" I asked. She shook her head. We entered the room. People and machines surrounded the bed. We stayed in the background. Keith craned his neck, trying to see his brother over and around the machines. Mrs. Evans came in, led by Heather. They made room for her on one side of Phil's bed. She took his hand. I leaned down and whispered that it was all right for Keith to go to his brother if he wanted. He gave a violent shake of his head. His eyes were saucer-wide with fear. Phil was dead. The nurses and doctors left, one by one, dragging their machines behind them. The original doctor said a few low words of comfort to Mrs. Evans, then stopped where we were. I explained to her what happened at the end, with Phil and Keith. She caught on quickly. She said to Keith, "You are never to think that you had any part in Phil's death. You're what kept him alive, I suspect. He held on so he could talk to you. His internal injuries were massive, beyond anybody's ability to cure. He died for medical reasons, not because he talked to you." Keith seemed to understand, but he said nothing. He moved closer to us. The doctor looked at us and said, "Take care of him." We said we would. She left. Mrs. Evans stared at her son. She barely moved. Heather murmured to her. Mrs. Evans moved closer and touched Phil's hand, then his face. She lingered in silence. Eventually, Heather led Mrs. Evans away. I began to move, to follow, but Keith remained rooted in place. I went back to him. Keith stared at the bed. I put my hand on his shoulder. "We have to go now," I whispered. Again he shook his head violently. "No." He brushed my hand off. "I'm sorry, Keith. I wish we could have saved him sooner. We can stay here a little longer, but then we'll have to go." He stared at the bed. "He was the best brother in the whole world." His words came out small and frightened. "He always protected me. I was never a pest to him. He took me places when I was little, to ball games and the zoo and the beach, and every Sunday afternoon in our old neighborhood we walked together, the 3 blocks to the old movie theater. We'd sit through each show twice. I want him back." I knew I had to ask the question. I wanted to keep it to myself forever. I was afraid of the answer. I said, "Keith, what did Phil mean when he said that about breaking away and cooling down like the other night?" He continued to stare at his brother. I asked softly, "What happened the other night?" Scott gave me a sharp look as if to say, "Go easy on the kid." Keith didn't see it. "I killed him," Keith said. "He got me up out of bed. It was real late. He made me get dressed. He said he had someone he wanted me to meet. I asked a bunch of questions, but he wouldn't answer. But Phil had warned me. He said if Dad attacked me or acted suspicious, to come get him, and that if he wasn't around to run as fast as I could, and that Phil would come protect me or find me. My dad and me were in the garage. I told him I wouldn't go, that I wanted Phil. He knocked me down. We wrestled. He was too big. He threw me down. He tried to push me into the car. I got away. I screamed at him to stop. I grabbed the nearest thing, my baseball bat. I yelled for Phil. He'd gone out around 11 o'clock. I didn't know if he was home. When I yelled, my dad got madder. He came at me like he was crazy. I dodged and ran outside. He came at me on the lawn. He was too big to run away. I swung the bat with all my might. I hit him. He fell. He made a lot of noise. I kept hitting him over and over and screaming. I think my mom heard, but she never came. My dad was dead. As I stood over him, Phil drove up. Phil said they'd never believe a little kid's story, and things would only be worse for me if anyone found out. We had to get him out of there. We put the body in the back seat of the car. Phil helped me straighten up the garage. I remembered Phil's story about the rain that night. Any evidence in the grass would have been washed away. "Why'd you pick my classroom to put him in?" "We wanted to put him in his own classroom. Phil knew my dad was involved in lots of illegal stuff at work. He said everybody would figure it out was something to do with that. Getting into school was pretty easy, but his body was heavy." It was around 5 o'clock, and the first janitor showed up just as we got in the door. "By your room." We couldn't carry him back out. They could see us. We decided to put him in the nearest room and get out while we could. Phil knew how to open all the doors in the school. He and his friends had broken in a couple of times years ago. We put him in a desk far back so he couldn't be seen from the window. No one saw us leave. Phil drove my dad's car to a side street in Chicago. I followed him in his car. He let me drive it sometimes, so I knew how. We drove back in plenty of time. We went to school like together. He paused. He walked over to the bed, smoothed the already perfect cover. He looked back over his shoulder at us. I think my mom guessed the truth, he said. That's why she's been so bad lately. He stopped smoothing the bed. His hands rested at his sides. His head drooped forward. I walked to him, put my hand on his shoulder. He didn't brush it away this time. I let the silence build. I felt the anger that had built up inside him, and now the added sorrow of his brother's death. Tears started down his face. All his hatreds, loneliness, fears, and living nightmares broke out, and he wept. I put my arms around him and held him tightly. He buried his tears in my shirt front. None of us, it seems, has enough magic to protect the children. Chapter 10. I sat on the couch in my living room, gazing out the picture window at the sunset hours before Scott ordered me out of the kitchen. It was Thanksgiving. Cooking noises drifted sporadically to my ears. I smiled at the sunset. I felt peaceful and rested, the kind of moment you remember from childhood when you were completely safe, which you wish you could replicate as an adult and then keep forever. But it's only a memory and a fleeting pang of calm and regret. 2 weeks had passed since we solved the murder. We talked until dawn that night. Neither of us disagreed, but we had to be sure. We didn't turn Keith in. He wasn't a criminal. He'd acted in self-defense. He didn't need to be crushed by an unfeeling bureaucracy. What the juvenile justice system could do to a kid was worse than many crimes. What his family had done to him was enough horror for one lifetime. We'd visited him several times. Heather Delacroix promised she would remain close to the family situation as long as necessary. From Frank, we'd learned that Evans had been offered $10,000 for Keith for a weekend. He was to bring Keith to meet Edgar and the group that might, for them, to see the boy for final approval. Frank confirmed that Evans was desperate for money and greedy as hell. We attended Phil's funeral. Scott and I talked for hours that night, agonizing about whether or not we could have saved Phil if we'd acted differently. Finally, Scott said that there's a lot of what-ifs in this world. He gave examples. What if we tested positive for the AIDS antibodies? We didn't. We're among the lucky ones. What if you get hit by a car tomorrow? You can. What if? Yourself forever. He told me to forget it and concentrate on the now. I'm not the type for regrets, and Scott was right. The cops acted like they had been acting. Robertson was an asshole and still wanted to arrest us for his own obscure reasons. Frank thanked us. He told me he'd keep in touch. Through him, I found out about the North case. So far, he had been questioned, but not arrested. The cops shut down the porno operation, of course. They arrested 3 more people connected with it. They hadn't found out how Evans and North had originally connected. I'm not sure it mattered anymore. The dead girl was still unidentified. To me, that was one of the saddest things about the whole case. Who were her mom and dad? Where were they? Were their hearts breaking somewhere, or did they even care? Frank said the possibilities of tracing her were small. Getting a murder conviction in Phil's and her case might prove difficult. Expensive lawyers hired by North played the system. We closed down one lethal porno operation. Convictions and closing others was somebody else's business. Meg had called earlier this morning. Rumors had ran rampant around school for 2 weeks about major changes coming. The local paper, which came out twice a week, Sundays and Thursdays, had the announcement this morning. I wanted to pick up a copy later. Meg told us that at last night's school board meeting, Sylvester and Armstrong resigned. The paper didn't give the details, she said, although it did say the board accepted the resignations with regrets. Criminal prosecution wasn't mentioned. I wasn't sure I cared about that now. Of course, reporters got hold of the story. Star player, hero catches crooks. It made the national news. The police helped a great deal to keep that kind of chaos to a minimum. The ball club's publicity spokesperson, Sylvia Finsterwald, did an excellent job. She was 56 years old, gray-haired, and efficient as hell. I think she liked me. I hope she did. She kept the interviews and harassment to a mild uproar the first few days, and to a bare minimum after that. Scott did most of the interviews. He did them all summer and half the winter anyway. He's good at it. Plus, the sports writers love him because he gives interviews readily. He wanted me to get more publicity. I convinced him I really wasn't interested. I got off the couch and walked to the window. It was my favorite time of the day. The last blues and grays hung suspended in the sky. Darkness gathered around the edges of all the bushes and trees that sloped to the distant fields. A star or two twinkled in a cloudless sky. Scott walked up behind and put his arms around me. He rested his head on my shoulder. I felt his chest against my back. "Dinner will be ready in 15 minutes, he whispered. Years ago, we decided Thanksgiving was our own, a kind of anniversary celebration for ourselves. I guess he cooks the meal. I did the first year. We wound up at the only McDonald's in 50 miles open on Thanksgiving. Since then, he cooks. He's not half bad. How are you feeling?" he asked. "Content," I said. "You know," he hesitated, then plunged on. "While I made dinner, He stopped. I turned to look at him. His eyes reflected back the deep blue of the fading horizon. I wanted to lose myself in them forever. Scott said, "I thought about all that's happened to us in these 8 years, and especially what we went through the past month." He cleared his throat, but his eyes remained steadily looking into mine. "The most important thing in all that's happened was the—" He stopped again when he resumed. His voice had reached its deepest thrum. "Remember that first night in the bar, the womb? While you were in the washroom, the bartender propositioned me. I turned him down. He asked me why not. I said it was because I love you. And I realized I haven't said that to you in a long time." He gazed at me in the last lights of dusk. "So, Tom Mason, I love you. I love you very, very much." He put his arms around me and held me tight. I melted into his warmth and strength. This was safest of all. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.